So what we're going to look at next is error handling in our API, and let's take a look at what this involves. Now, this is the current situation with our application. We have our API that receives HTTP requests and it sends back HTTP responses. Now, these HTTP responses, they can be okay, or they can be sending back an error response. And if we take a look at the HTTP response codes, then we have 200 type responses. Anything in the 200 range is considered an OK response. A 300 type response would mean that the request has not been modified or it's some kind of redirection. Anything in the 400 range is considered a client-side error, which means that the client's attempted to ask for something that doesn't exist, in which case we'd send back a 404 not found. Or they've attempted to access something they're not authorized to access, in which case we'd send back a 401 unauthorized response. And then we've got our 500 server errors, and typically if we throw an exception, then we're going to be sending back a 500 internal server error, and that means something has gone wrong with our API. Now, we're not handling any of these errors at the moment. All we're doing is sending back either a 200 OK response, or we're sending back a 500 internal server error. We don't have any way to send anything else in between that at the moment, other than the 400 bad requests for validation that we've just looked at. But that uses the validation middleware instead of using our API controllers. So what we need to think about is what's going to be responsible for sending back HTTP error responses. Now, if we take a look at one way we could do this, and we could handle the logic for this inside our API controller method. In this particular example, this is just using a snippet from our values controller. We could go and try and get the value from the database, and we could check what we get back from the database, and if the value was null, then we could return from our API controller a 404 not found. And we can return this from our API controller because our API controller has access to the HTTP context, which means we can write our response and exit out of the request and return a 404 not found response. Which is great if we were putting our logic in our API controllers, but we're not. And we don't have access to the HTTP response inside our application handlers. Our application handlers have no idea what kind of response we're sending back to the client. Our application handler merely knows that if it receives an object, it processes that object, it returns an object. It has absolutely no idea how its response finds its way to our client's browser. But we do need a way to stop the execution of our request if we get an error in our application handler. Now, here's an example of how we can do it. And the same type of request, we're going to see if we've got an activity in our database. And if the activity doesn't exist, then we need to return something to our client and stop the execution of the request. And in this case, the only way to get out of this request without returning something to our API controller is to throw an exception. And in this case, we're just throwing a normal 500 server error exception. But this isn't what we want to send back to our clients if they have a client-side error, such as the activity was not found. We still want to send back a HTTP error response with a 404 not found. Now, in order for our application handlers to stop the execution of the request when they receive an error, the process that we're going to use is to throw exceptions, but we're going to use our own type of exception. We'll create our own, and in this exception, we'll be able to return an HTTP error response as opposed to a server exception. And in order to do that, we're going to need to create some exception handling middleware so we can see what type of exception we're returning. And if it's one of our own exceptions where we want to return a HTTP status code, in this case of a 404 not found, then we want to write that error response into what we're sending back in an HTTP response. But in order to do that, we're going to need access to the HTTP context. And one way we can do this is by creating some exception handling middleware. And we've been using middleware inside this course so far, but this time we're going to need to create our own. And the ASP.NET Core request pipeline consists of a sequence of request delegates, called one after the other. And this is why the ordering of middleware is important. And the flow of execution follows the black arrows in this particular diagram. Now, each of these delegates, each of these pieces of middleware, can perform operations before and after the next delegate. And when it comes to exception handling, we need to call this early in the pipeline so that we can catch exceptions that occur in later stages of the pipeline. If we have an error before we've created our exception handling middleware, we won't have anything to catch it with. So what we're going to do is create some middleware, and our middleware does have access to the HTTP context because this is our HTTP request pipeline. And if we catch an exception, then we're going to take a look at the exception, see what type of exception it is, and if it's a kind of REST exception where we want to return a 404 not found, for example, then what we want to do is write a 400 or a 404 error response and send that back to the client. And this is where we're going with error handling in our API, and this is what we'll take a look at next.